is always safer in the hands of the people than in the conference rooms of any elite.
Sam Seder.
They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
The Majority Report with Sam Seder.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated?
It is Thursday, April 6th, 2023. My name is Emma Vigeland, in for Sam Seder, and this is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Van Jackson, author of Pacific Power Paradox, America's Statecraft and the Fate of the Asian Peace. And later in the show, Murtaza Hussein of The Intercept will be with us to discuss Twitter's help in Narendra Modi's censorship efforts in India. Meanwhile, the judge presiding over the Trump case and his family have received dozens of threats, apparently. Trump's sons posted his daughter's photo and employment info on social media. Publicly, House Republicans are huffing and puffing about Alvin Bragg, and they want to haul him in front of Congress. Privately, they're like, yeah, we can't do that. Mike Pence reportedly won't fight the court order compelling his testimony to the January 6th grand jury. Rupert Murdoch and his sons Kendall and Lachlan and James, could be forced to testify in the Dominion lawsuit, the judge says. A ProPublica investigative piece has revealed that Clarence Thomas has taken undisclosed luxury trips on yachts and planes with Club for Growth billionaire GOP megadonor named Harlan Crow. Sounds fake. Or it's either like a fake movie villain or a frat guy in like reality right now. So I don't know, just a little weird. Tennessee Republican supermajority is expected to vote to expel 3 Democrats for using a bullhorn during gun reform protests, God forbid. Gretchen Whitmer has signed a bill repealing Michigan's 1931 abortion ban, a campaign promise for her. And in New Mexico, Democratic Governor Grisham is also signing into law protections for abortion providers from prosecution. However, Idaho just became the first state to criminalize out-of-state abortions for minors without parental consent. The state also just banned gender-affirming care for minors. Speaking of, ACLU data finds that over 400 anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced this calendar year. Israeli forces have raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque for the second straight night during Ramadan, brutalizing worshippers. Researchers have found that levels of air pollution may increase the likelihood of dementia. And lastly, Emmanuel Macron meets with Chinese President Xi Jinping over Ukraine, or at least that's the public declaration for the reason for the meeting. Diverging from some boilerplate Western cold shoulder politics, guess we gotta go back to freedom fries again. All this and more on today's Majority Report. Welcome to the show, everybody. It's an Majority Report Thursday. Although it's a Majority Report for today, Friday, and next week, and Bradley Jordy Report for the end of time. When Matt comes in...
This has been the Bradley Jordy Report for like an entire astrological sign.
So what are you going to do once you eventually take this time off after having to, cover and do 2 jobs for a whole month?
I'm going to sit, and then I'm going to stand, and then I'm going to sit.
And then you're going to stand?
And then I'm going to stand.
But will you be doing so in your apartment?
Yeah.
Okay. They're perfect. Just not
just
here.
moving my legs,
Right?
Getting the having blood flow around my body.
That sounds amazing. We don't have enough blood flow. That's what many people are saying.
They are saying it.
Let's start here because Tucker Carlson had Marjorie Taylor Greene on his program last night. I'm not sure. Was this the entirety of the hit? Do we know if she was on for longer? Because it's hilarious to me if he only gave her this 3-minute slot. I'd imagine that there's some contempt for Marjorie Taylor Greene and her complete wackadoodle nature, even within the Tucker Carlson white supremacist kind of wing of the Republican Party and media apparatuses. But she's as close to the Republican base as any elected member of Congress. And that's why they feel compelled to have her on. So he only had her on for 3 minutes.
Yeah.
See, that's the thing, right? Like, they're checking a box here. They don't like Marjorie Taylor Greene because they have immense contempt for the base that they're constantly trying to appeal to. And she's a lot closer to the people that Tucker's speaking to than Tucker is in his fancy Manhattan studio where he's speaking to her here. He could have also spoken to her from his studio in Maine at his compound or his one in Florida. But he's here in New York, where she just visited. And she has a lot to say about New York City to Tucker Carlson, who, from my understanding, is seated in New York City as she says this to him.
So it looked pretty crazy in New York yesterday. And of course, looking crazy was the whole point of this, to terrify swing voters into never voting for Donald Trump. What was it like? Well, Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia was there for the arraignment. And before she arrived, the mayor of the city, already failed just a year into office, Eric Adams, described her as a criminal and implied he would punish her if she misbehaved. Meanwhile, actual lunatics showed up and prevented her from speaking. Watch.
Sir, can I ask what those are for?
So we hear that Marjorie Taylor Greene is coming to the city right here. So we brought some whistles to hand out to people to drown her out with some noise.
That's a sitting member, an elected member of the Congress. Everyone can see where this is going. Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Can you pause it?
Tonight.
So when he said lunatic, I'd seen this clip already. I thought that we were getting like, okay, maybe some crazy person showed up and was harassing her in her face. It was just some protester calmly explaining why he's showing his discontent for, yes, she's not a convicted criminal, but in my estimation, anyone who tries to overturn the democratic results of an election is a criminal. She's also a total government leech. I mean, what happened to all that PPP loan money, Marjorie Taylor Greene? We could look into that, but yeah, go on.
Also, just want to be clear. I think it's amazing that they found the one guy who was also handing out whistles to try and drown her out, and did not clip the interview exchange between NBC News' Ben Collins. If you guys would like to go to his Twitter account and find that video, where he spoke to a guy who was also handing out whistles and also a supporter of Marjorie Taylor Greene's, saying he just wanted to make as much noise as humanly possible. So it wasn't just one lib side drowning her out. Her own supporters were doing the whistling.
Yeah, I mean, but, like...
Not that it matters.
Not that it
so
matters
frivolous,
at all.
like...
But they had this narrative prepped, to your point. There's no amount of facts on the ground that was going to change that Marjorie Taylor Greene was a complete victim. They're professional victims over there in the Republican Party when she decided to do a political stunt in New York City for the short period of time that she was here. And I also just love the chyron there. Marjorie Taylor Greene experiences NYC's famous hospitality. That's seemingly tongue-in-cheek and sarcastic, but like, actually, yeah, the stereotype is that New Yorkers are kind of rude. So you're not breaking anything, although I would in some ways disagree with that, but we're at least impatient. There's that.
Right, to recount what she saw in New York yesterday. Congressman, thanks so much for coming on. What was that like?
Well, it was absolute chaos, and that's what the mayor of New York City wanted to happen to me. You see, he threatened me and basically put out a dog whistle for violence against me. And then there was a funded text alert that went out naming me by name and telling people to do exactly what that man was doing, hand out whistles and try to create a chaotic scene.
You know, like the Trump kids just did to the judge that's just trying to do his job, presiding over the Trump case, posting the judge's daughter's photo and her work information.
Naming me by name, a sitting member of Congress, naming me by my name.
Right, naming that there were going to be
John Proctor over here.
Demonstrations outside of the courthouse, probably sending out like, hey, if you want to be a counter protester, here's how you can be involved.
Tucker,
Marjorie Taylor Greene will be there.
Tucker, they posted my assassination coordinates.
All right.
What that man was doing, hand out whistles and try to create a chaotic scene of violence and assault. And that's against the law, by the way, Tucker. You see, they didn't want me to be able to protest and use my First Amendment rights. And they wanted violence. I think they wanted that to happen because they want to repeat January 6th all over again. They want all of us Trump supporters, MAGA, basically Republicans and just good Americans to look like criminals. And that's what they do in communist countries. And that's actually what we're seeing today.
Well, the first thing to do, of course, is take away your freedom to speak. And if you can't say what you really think, then you're not a free person, you're a slave. And once you are, then there's really nothing they can't do to you. Do you think people understand the implications of not allowing someone to speak?
I don't think they do. I don't think people realize what dangerous times we're living in.
Now.
You see, the Democrat Party, they're the fascists. They want to cancel our voices.
Nice.
They want to censor us, and they want to completely force us into complying. You see, the reason why they're prosecuting, or should we say persecuting, Donald Trump is for the crime of actually winning the 2016 presidential election. That's what they're in hysterics over, and they've never gotten over it. But what they really want to do is once they remove their top political opponent, which is President Trump, they're going to come after all of us. This has happened repeatedly throughout history, and people need to wake up to the reality of the danger we're living in.
Really quick, since you were just there, but Mayor Adams described New York as, quote, his home. How did his home look? Pretty neat and tidy?
No, his home is disgusting. I compared it to what I called Gotham City. The streets are filthy. They're covered with people basically dying on drugs. They can't even stand up. They're falling over. There's so much crime in the city. I can't comprehend how people live there. It was repulsive. It smells bad. And I think it's a terrible place.
Yeah, with some nice people, I will say that. Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene.
You got a little smarted there. You got a little smarted.
Thank you, Tucker.
Yeah, thank you, Tucker. I mean, look, it's just
my daddy's from there. Marjorie.
Right. Marjorie. And I abide here 1/3 of the year. I mean, I go to Florida for 51% for tax purposes, but
in my nuclear bunker in Maine.
That too. But sometimes I get in my limousine and I drive to the Fox News studio because naturally I have an apartment in the city. I mean, what am I going to do? Commute in and out? I mean, I need that.
I'm no strap hanger.
Really, right. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I mean, it must have been like a war zone. She must have seen a lot of crap on her Escalade ride from her Midtown New York City 5-star hotel to the courthouse with her political, with her protections from her Secret Service type staff. And then after doing a 30-minute stunt with Jack Posobiec, her drive to the airport.
I also just appreciate that her...
Must have been harrowing.
I also appreciate that her review of the city and that she was in for about 3 hours in one of the most, like, securitized, protected areas on an off day because it's literally the municipal building and court area of Lower Manhattan. As which I've been there. I've been there obviously for like just in that area. She's lying because
she's lying
because obviously because it is by nature, just because of how many government buildings there are. They don't even allow any sort of like blight to stay around for too long. Blight, I'm saying in terms of how they would probably characterize it. But I also just appreciate that her review of New York City was basically the first verse from The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. She's like, broken glass everywhere. People pissing on the stairs. They just don't care.
Yeah, it really is like that. But do you just notice how she has this ready to go, and the confidence that she has in her lies is astounding to me. There's never really a second guessing moment for her. I've lived within 20 miles of New York City my entire life, except for, when I was in college. And now I've lived in different areas of Manhattan. I've lived in different areas of Brooklyn. I've moved around the city a good amount. I can confidently say I've never seen multiple people dying on the streets, probably ever, but especially within the span of one day, when the extent of her New York City experience was, again, her Escalade ride from her hotel to the protest to the airport. Now, I don't know that for sure, but I'd wager it was something quite similar to that. So she's just lying. And then there's a ton of people that want to believe it and be like, yes, hellhole. And you look at crime rates throughout the country, they're much higher in more mid-sized cities, smaller cities in the center of the country, in red states as well, crime is higher. So it's just counterfactual, but like she got what she wanted. She knew from the moment that she came to New York, this is what the end result of her analysis was going to be, and she had a pre-primed smaller slot on Tucker Carlson to make that case to the geriatric audience.
I also just appreciate that she's still like, this is all about the 2016 election, when the only people that continually talk about how the 2016 election is still continually being relitigated are the people who keep mentioning that the 2016 election keeps being relitigated. Like, the shelf life for all of these controversies for white right-wingers like her and Tucker and people on Fox News is literally endless, which is also why I think it's like a resistance lib take of mine, that I was seeing a little bit on Twitter with this clip, but it was like, if AOC was like, I went to Rome, Georgia, in Georgia's 14th congressional district, and it is an absolute hellhole.
It's disgusting.
It is disgusting. A bunch of rednecks live there. Like, it is a freaking backwater.
Right.
I mean, there'd be multiple lawsuits filed. I think Sean Hannity and Tucker Carlson would attempt to arrest her in person. I think the entire right-wing media ecosystem would mobilize in a militarized fashion to castigate AOC for pillorying the heartland.
They would censure her in 36 hours.
For sure.
Guarantee it. And what's also interesting is she didn't say 2020, that he won the 2020 election. Interesting that she didn't say that.
She brought up the W.
It's interesting that she did not say that. My guess is, in the midst of this Dominion lawsuit, Tucker's producer said, absolutely not.
All right, 3.5 minutes. Get her off.
Yeah. And
really quickly, how was New York?
I'll never forget this one moment, and we'll get to our guests in a sec, but in the 2016 debate, where Ted Cruz was talking about how disgusting New York City is and how crime-ridden it is, and Trump looked down at his podium and just said, I'm really offended by that. William F. Buckley is from New York City, and I was there on 9/11, and I saw all of these people banding together and coming together to support one another. And Ted Cruz looked like he crapped his pants when that happened.
He was like, Ted, you're gutless.
But the point is just that, I don't even know. It's the New York City as a hellhole has been a narrative in Republican politics for decades at this point. It doesn't matter what the results are or the reality is on the ground. They'll just keep saying it, and she's lying, but it doesn't really matter because it feels true to the people watching that. All right, guys, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to be speaking with Van Jackson. We are back. Emma Vigeland here with Dr. Van Jackson, Senior Lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington, author of Pacific Power Paradox, American Statecraft, and the Fate of the Asian Peace. Van, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me. Been listening to this for like 6 years now, so this is
great.
Oh,
really? Well, that's great. So when you came up with the title of your book, I saw, you sent the document, the PDF, so I could check it out before doing this interview. And it's PPP is the way that the document is. Like, did you know in advance that PPP would become to mean something else? Because it is the title is catchy as hell.
Yeah, alliteration is a seller. No, it was totally last minute. Actually, it was going to be called something much wonkier and not cool. In the book, the argument wasn't even going to be that there's this paradox of American power in Asia. That's like what came out through the research process. I started writing it as like a critique of Trump in the Trump years. And then I started recognizing that like, oh shit, all my critiques of Trump are actually congruent with larger critiques of kind of establishment liberal primacy. And that made me like have a kind of reckoning with the foreign policy apparatus that I'd been involved in my whole career up to that point.
So, I mean, you were a Defense Department staffer during the Obama administration. I'm really curious to get your take on this current moment, because I think on this show, at least, I've been pretty aggressive, trying, maybe tediously so, trying to sound the alarm about how this bipartisan consensus in China hawkery is building with every year. It concerns me deeply, and you have experience with this kind of mindset, having worked in the Defense Department. So what's your assessment of this current moment of anti-China hawkery, as I say, that really has been pushed, unfortunately, by the Biden administration as a centerpiece of their foreign policy?
Yeah, it's unfortunate. There's this false notion that is just everywhere, saturating Washington, that like China, the threat of China is a sense of unity, and therefore if you can outbid people on how much of a threat China is and basically inflate it, you're just inflating national unity, man. And obviously that's going to end in no good way. Like that's going to be tragic for all of us, except for some oligarchs. And so the process that democratic politics are trapped in right now, like Democratic Party politics, is that they can't be seen, which is very Cold War-esque, they can't be seen as weak on national security. National security is basically all things big red menace, right? All things China threat. And the really pernicious aspect of this, aside from aping the Cold War in a kind of farcical way, is that now we are doing this process of things that would be good: industrial policy, right? Inflation Reduction Act, chips and like trying to, restore domestic manufacturing. We got all this green energy investment stuff that 5 years ago would have seemed impossible. And Biden deserves some credit for that. Unfortunately, it's the larger geopolitical context that's making that politically possible. Why do you think somebody like Joe Manchin goes along with these large spending bills? A little bit of it is maybe like rent seeking or side payments, but a lot of it has to do with China. It's still, all of this domestic economic stuff is anchored on the China threat. And so the Democrats are locked in to this succumbing to the rivalry impulse that the MAGA right and the far right uses to avoid accountability for basically being fascists at this point. Like they're post-liberal, post-democratic, and China is what allows that to happen. China is what allows them to focus energy on, banning TikTok instead of dealing with the climate crisis or dealing with like a higher minimum wage. No time for that. We got China trying to buy our land,
Yeah. I mean, it's just deeply depressing that the Biden administration seemingly, and by the way, Schumer has been pushing this for years, but the CHIPS Act seemingly felt that they could not pass a domestic agenda where we onshore some of our the production of necessary goods, which like was laid bare during the pandemic because of our convoluted supply chain process. It's really unfortunate that they felt that they could not pass that kind of domestic agenda without making it, framing it within the context of China's so bad. Because one, I mean, and we'll get into the implications for U.S. foreign policy and militarism, but just here domestically, it's just bound to hurt Chinese Americans, Asian Americans, and their standing here in the United States.
Totally. That's actively happening too. Yeah. So there is this problem of like you're wedding the American economy to these forces of militarism, right? And those forces of militarism in the like Spencer Ackerman sense, bring the war home, Kathleen Belew, it's, you know, you're creating you're feeding the forces of violence in American society by anchoring its economy to militarism in the big meta sense. But in the real foreign policy war sense, right? What the Democrats have committed to is American global primacy, which is not so different from past presidents, right? It's not so different. That is what Trump articulated. His strategy document said specifically. The Obama administration that I worked in articulated this 100%, right? This is not new to say that America seeks to retain global primacy. What's new is that our ability to sustain that standard of global domination, which is most important in Asia and most under challenge in Asia, is just eroding. And it's eroding partly because of like our own policies, but the process of trying to seek to retain primacy is totally at odds with what preserving peace requires in Asia. So we've had this unique period of 44 years, the Asian peace, where the region has not had new interstate wars. And the book talks about like, well, why is that? And America's part of the reason, but also part of the threat to the Asian peace. And what I'm trying to say right now is that like in our current moment, pursuing primacy directly undermines the sources of peace. And so like we're feeding forces of war in order to win politics at home, in order to get domestic reshoring and IRA and stuff like that. And that's a bad bargain.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get into the history here in a sec, but I have one more question for you, a kind of larger umbrella one. How much of this is just rebranded Red Scare politics? Like this is just all of the mechanisms in the United States for Cold War, Red Scare, anti-communist nationalism and militarism are still there. They never maybe they were a little more dormant in certain sectors of our government, but they're all seemingly getting activated in a newer form in this current moment.
Yeah, 100%. That's one of my major concerns, apart from, great power war, nuclear war. It's the renewal of Red Scare politics. So like in the early Cold War, the conservative movement had trouble getting traction basically in the New Deal order. Like it was not politically popular until they were able to seize on anti-communism. Mm-hmm. And so we think about McCarthy, but McCarthy was just one node in the larger network, and his star burned out pretty quickly anyway. But Red Scare politics became like the defining flavor of the Cold War, and that purged from government service socialists, social democrats, queers, certain minorities, right? If you had a hyphen, if you were a hyphenated American, you fell under accusations of disloyalty, claims of fifth columnist because you wanted, a better welfare state. All the like Red Scare politics fought all that stuff, and it was just successful for the conservative movement. And they're doing it again because it kind of works, unless we call them on their bullshit,
It's another instance, frankly, of the Democratic Party just more easily feeding into right-wing framing than the left would would like, and what is good for the country in general. But let's then back up to the origins of the Asian peace as you describe. You mentioned the decades-long kind of lack of interstate wars in the continent of Asia. What this begins in the wake of, major United States anti-communist wars in Korea and then in Vietnam. How much of that was forged in the wreckage of the United States' imperial desires in the continent? Does that kind of have its influence felt today in terms of the way the Asian peace is constructed in any sense?
Yeah, I mean, so why haven't there been new interstate wars in East Asia or the Pacific since 1979? Well, if you go back for 150 years before 1979, Asia was racked by violence of all kinds, largely imposed from without, but also organically, right? And America, for 100 years before 1979, was almost always implicated in the interstate wars that were happening. America was an empire, right? So the 1979, well, what's different? What happens? What changes, right? Part of what we don't acknowledge about the lack of wars in Asia since 79, 44 years now, is that America hasn't been waging new wars in Asia, right? It's not just that Asian states haven't been fighting each other. America hasn't been bombing folks since 79.
We're busy in the Middle East, right? So
we had other stuff to do,
yeah,
right? But we were also getting ready for it all the time. And the big thing, the big explanatory factor why 79 is the year that China and the US normalized diplomatic relations. So Kissinger and Nixon did the whole opening to China thing a few years earlier. 79 is the pivot point. So the last war in Asia is China invading Vietnam in a punitive campaign for Vietnam invading Cambodia, right? And this is on the back of us having withdrawn from Vietnam. And so we normalize relations with Asia's other great power, who's this, big red menace, and we soften that image. And then we say, you know what, we can work with them. And we don't balance against the Soviet Union. We triangulate diplomatic relations with the Soviets and China to maintain a kind of equilibrium, just make stuff stable, and to cooperate where it's in our interests. And this has the effect, aside from bringing China into the global financialized economy and turning it into an economic powerhouse eventually, it has the real effect of turning off the revolutionary military adventurism of Chinese foreign policy. So up to that point, it's like Maoism being exported all around the world. They're revolutionaries, right? And it's our ability to establish this strategic rapprochement with China that has a pacifying effect in Sino-US relations. We're no longer threatening each other, but also in the region. And that is the foundation for the Asian peace for the next 44 years.
Can I ask, what were the internal motivations for that normalization? Is it really just kind of free market corporations wanting to have a symbiotic or at least non-aggressive relationship with a major business power and the massive opening that they could have with Chinese markets?
So it started to become that at a certain point. The motivation for placid strategic relations with China, it's kind of shifted over time. So in the 90s, the Clinton years, is when we shifted to this greed is good view, I guess, hardcore on China. Prior to that, initially the opening was about look, it's nonsensical to court this large continental threat in Asia. We should be able to make peace with them to specifically help us deal with the Vietnam War. So we don't need to be fighting them by proxy in Vietnam,
Mm.
and they can help us get North Vietnam to the negotiating table, et cetera, et cetera. Kissinger drew false equivalencies between like the Taiwan situation and the Vietnam situation and this kind of thing. And basically, we were in a position to try and achieve some like strategic gains, strategic stability by engaging them, which is kind of like low cost, no cost. Like, why not? Well, why didn't we think of that earlier, right? Well, because of anti-communism, you know? So that was the original rationale, that strategic calculation. And then in the 80s under Reagan, it became heavily about countering the Soviet Union. So it was this more splittist kind of thing where we want to like anchor China as the bulwark against the Soviets. And so we start in the Reagan administration, we start arming up the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and we build up China's military. We're the biggest source of their modernization militarily. And ironically, this is in the Reagan years. And then we stop that process only because of Tiananmen Square, the human rights stuff, right?
Right.
And so after Tiananmen, then the rationale for détente switches. And that's when you get the neoliberalism stuff. That's when you get the greed is good stuff.
Okay, so it originally was just Reagan arming anybody that could be anti-communist in the USSR kind of Cold War position that he was taking. We know what he did in the Middle East as well. So you're just handing out weaponry everywhere as long as you're going to oppose the Soviets, basically.
100%, yeah. But now, like since the 90s, the coalition, this is really hard for the left to get its arms around. I don't see many people acknowledging it. The neoliberals, the corporate liberals, the like neoliberal globalization constituency has been doing all of the heavy lifting politically to sustain this détente with China.
Yep.
And of course, one of our strongest commitments on the left is against neoliberalism. But what we're getting under the Biden administration is like the IRA stuff. It's not necessarily post-neoliberal, not yet. It just it dispenses with the free market rhetoric stuff. But like we're still choosing capital over labor. The balance of class forces is not shifting so far, you know. And that's not me dogging the domestic investment stuff. It's that like that hasn't broken us out of the encasement of neoliberalism yet.
Right.
And what it has done, though, by weakening neoliberalism as like an ideology, that has meant that the political actors who work in support of Sino-US détente, well, they're weak politically right now. Their voice doesn't carry the same weight that it used to in Washington. And that means that the forces against rivalry have been beaten for now by the forces of rivalry. And that's what the Red Scare politics is connected to and is getting amplified because of.
And then here's something that I know Sam has mentioned a lot, and I think it's important to emphasize, and I was happy to see how much you do so in your book. That before 9/11, there was this kind of neocon desire and consensus building where Clinton and Bush wanted to main supremacy versus Asia, and the pivot to Asia was imminent, and we needed to kind of ramp up this rivalry because this was the only way to maintain primacy, which, like, again, it's going to kill the... It's really going to have harmful effects on many of the people promoting it, right? Just maintaining primacy at all costs. But putting that aside, that the 90s and the early 2000s, where the Middle East becomes the center point of U.S. militarism, how was that pivot? How did that pivot play out? Where there were a lot of neocons who wanted to move towards China and Asia, but they were kind of bogged down in the Middle East.
Yeah, so the Republican Party, like foreign policy mandarins, they were always divided about this whole Sino-US détente thing. There was always like the neocon, the Paul Wolfowitzes. Paul Wolfowitz hated Kissinger. He used to write internal official memos on DoD letterhead just dunking all over Kissinger. He's self-aggrandizing. China's not important, blah, blah, blah. And it was also that they could do the neocon thing, which is like you position America in the world to literally fight the communists, right? So those people, those constituents who were always against détente in the first place, the Reagan administration gives them kind of new life in a sense. And then in the 90s, they're cashing in and, defense contractors and Halliburton and all that. And while they're out of power during the Clinton administration, they're starting to advise then Governor George W. Bush. They're setting up the whole presidency thing, and they're selling George W. Bush on the neocon agenda. They announced this thing, right? Project for a New American Century in the late 90s. And it became American foreign policy to the letter, including under Obama. It was all about quadrupling missile defense investments, regime change in Iraq. The China threat for the first time is being identified as like a thing. In 96, we had a very brief Taiwan Strait crisis with China, and it was handled like pretty smoothly. And it was that point though that the defense intellectuals in China and in the United States realized like, oh, we have an irreducible conflict of interest over Taiwan, and our militaries need to prepare to deal with each other. And so that was kind of a big turning point. And ever since that point, 96, you've got these neocons who dominate DC at this point, right? And I mean, to this day, they still kind of dominate DC in a way. And the neocons have been all about China rivalry, and they were preparing to do great power competition. And George W. Bush used the phrase strategic competition with China until the war on terror happened, right? And that just shifted everything, but it put it on hold. So like the Paul Wolfowitz types, the neocons all retained that China rivalry impulse, democracy, autocracy, all of that. And they found that, China was growing more belligerent in the Obama era. And in the Obama era, America was in relative decline, global financial crisis. It's disproportionately our fault. This feeds this narrative of like rising power, declining power. And all the while, America has been retooling its military to be able to fight great power wars, which requires all the sexy high-end capabilities with big price tags that you don't need in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the future of war, the future of the defense industrial complex is indexed against a great power war. Well, who's the other great power that we can fight? Only China.
Yeah,
only
it's
China,
not Russia. I mean,
No.
that is so well said and important to point out, because it's not just the fact that the United States is reopening 4 military bases in the Philippines that were defunct because we're trying to have more of a presence in China's proximity. It's not just that the United States is forging military deals with Australia so that we have submarines and different kinds of military capacity even closer to China as well. It's the nature of the technology that's being used, and the fact that it seems like in DC they're convinced that China's desire to achieve regional hegemony is equivalent to the United States' desire to maintain primacy, which is hilarious because we have, 700 plus military bases abroad, and China has, I could count them on my one hand.
Yeah, like one. Yeah. It's a pretty gross imbalance. The only way that kind of math works, where it's like somehow we are still the good guys in this, and like I'm not saying China is the good guys by no stretch, but the only way you can like focus on China to the exclusion of the US is if you're totally drunk on American exceptionalism, which is this pathology of blamelessness that like removes ourselves from the analytical picture of cause and effect. It basically takes international relations and then says, you know what? International relations is not relational. What they do doesn't depend on what we do. We do our stuff. And then if they do something we don't like, then we come in with the hammer. Why? Because primacy, right? And that's why the techno containment policy that the Biden administration has embraced, like the extreme competition against China, to use Biden's own words, that is the apotheosis of what's been cooking for the last 20 years. Like, this has been in the works. It's just that now there's nothing stopping it politically. There's no war on terror to distract us. We're past the global financial crisis, but the goal of primacy remains. And to retain that goal in this new historical conjuncture, well, it requires breaking up regional cohesion. It requires decoupling rather than interdependence. It requires exclusion, right? It requires all these antagonistic security constructs that tries to take security from others so that we can have security. And that kind of thinking only ever ends badly, you know?
Well, it's a false zero-sum construction for power and well, maybe not power, but for safety. And that should be what the government is trying to provide for its citizens on a foreign policy basis. But frankly, and this will be my last question, how much of this do you think is... There's, of course, a neoliberal neocon consensus, but there seems to be something that underlies U.S. Foreign policy orthodoxy, and you would know, having given your work, that it's like this self-serving belief that war and conflict is inevitable, and so it's just who do we pivot to next to maintain primacy?
Yeah, basically, we're in this position where we're convincing ourselves that China's going to invade Taiwan. That's not remotely true.
Yeah.
Nobody's got a crystal ball. We're really bad at predicting wars as human beings, as social scientists or policymakers. And so the idea that like we know China's going to do this is just not right. It's not borne out by facts. Most China experts don't believe that nonsense. But the belief in it is the self-fulfilling prophecy. It's what justifies optimizing our economy for war. This whole semiconductor thing, it's about war fighting, right? America dominates the high ground of the semiconductor industry. I don't want to say a percentage, like 90% or something of like semiconductor design, the intellectual work of semiconductor production. We dominate that. What we don't dominate is the low end manufacturing, producing actual semiconductors at scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who does that? Well, China, of course, right? But why does that matter? Who gives a shit? Well, it matters because in wartime, and only in wartime, do you need to be able to mass produce that stuff under duress. And China in wartime probably ain't going to be producing it for us. And so that's why it suddenly becomes a priority. So it's one of many, many examples of how like we're retooling everything for war optimization, and we're doing it at the expense of war prevention. And that's the bargain that no one's facing up to.
Well, I couldn't recommend the book more highly. Pacific Power Paradox, American Statecraft, and the Fate of the Asian Peace. We're going to put links in the description here on YouTube where you're watching this and in the podcast. Dr. Van Jackson, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we'll be joined by Murtaza Hussein. are back, and we are joined now by Murtaza Hussein, reporter at The Intercept, who had a piece that came out last week with a friend of the show, Ryan Grimm, entitled "Elon Musk's Twitter Widens Its Censorship of Modi's Critics." Murtaza, thanks so much for coming on. I really love your work.
Well, thanks for having me.
Of course. So interesting that free speech warrior Elon Musk, who acquired Twitter for $44 billion because he believes in the principles of free speech, might be working with a fascist to on his aggressive censorship efforts. I mean, shocking to hear that, right?
Yeah, Elon Musk, when he took over Twitter and in the run-up to that, he had a lot of very idealistic rhetoric that he put forward as to what his motivations were. It never really seemed too sincere to me, but I think we're seeing now in the way Twitter is actually being run is that he is not very committed to free speech. He's willing to maybe indulge a few pet causes. I think one he's particularly interested in is the rights of conservative speech in the United States. But Twitter is a global company, and there are countries all over the world where Twitter is very important and millions of people use it. And his commitment to actually upholding free speech in where it really matters, in instances of government repression in countries which are not perfectly democratic or undemocratic or authoritarian, it's really been lacking. And I think one thing we've seen recently is that Twitter India, under the previous ownership, it had a lot of pressure from the Modi government, which it resisted. But now that Elon has taken power, he's fired a lot of the staff in that office. And we're seeing a much more cooperation and you could say control of Twitter by the Indian government during a period where democracy seems to be backsliding in that country.
Well, let's give people some context then on that democratic backslide, if you don't mind, Murtaza, because a lot of people would be familiar with Narendra Modi, I'm sure this audience is. But when did he come to power? 2014? Is that?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He came to power after many, many years of the Congress Party being in power in India, which is a more establishment liberal party of India. People had a lot of complaints with that party for reasons, some of which were understandable, but patronage and corruption and so forth. And he's at the helm of a rival party called the BJP, which is a religious nationalist party.
Yeah,
it's much
Hindu
more
nationalist. Yeah,
Hindu nationalist party. Yeah, it's much more right wing and so forth. And Modi had a very checkered background before he became leader of the country. He was actually prohibited from entering the United States for some time due to his involvement in human rights abuses and some massacres and riots which took place in India in a state which he was governor some years before. But now he's prime minister, and he is certainly changing India in many, many ways. And one way we're seeing is a crackdown on minorities and liberal civil society groups, crackdowns and consolidations of the press. So India is democracy, which existed for about 70 years. It's certainly degrading and becoming something quite different. And you're seeing a lot of outcry about this from international human rights groups, the press, and so forth. And I would say, from the perspective of a social media company, that if the ostensible goal or ostensible reason for purchasing of Twitter by Elon Musk's part was to further a liberal ideal like free speech, you certainly need to resist a bit the attempts by authoritarian or quasi-authoritarian governments to crush that. And instead, we're seeing, unfortunately, Twitter acting more and more as a handmaiden to the Indian government in the trajectory in which it's going at the moment.
And the trajectory is, yes, censorship as well, but censorship that aids Modi's essentially political discrimination and crackdown of rights for minority groups, particularly Muslim citizens within India. I mean, 200 million Muslims live in India, but they are still a minority and are actively being discriminated against. I mean, Modi has used this tactic many times, right? I think most notoriously recently in Kashmir, where he was immensely aggressive in censorship, shutting off the internet for a long period of time, and that's obviously a majority Muslim state. How much of this is instrumental or foundational for Modi's politics and his rule over India, censorship as a tool to maintain the power of the groups that of the majority that he's kind of representing here?
One thing people usually don't know is that India actually leads the world in internet shutdowns of this type, which you're referring to, which took place in Kashmir. And most of it, a lot of it has been targeted, as you said, against Indian Muslims, who are a very, very large minority, but still a minority in India. 250 million people, something like that. But lately, and what we saw last week, is that this shutdown actually targeted a different province, which was not Muslim majority. It's actually a Sikh majority province or plurality, Punjab. And Punjab was a site of a separatist movement in the 1980s. It was an insurgency at that time in Punjab. And there's some dissatisfaction or unhappiness among many Sikh Punjabis with the Indian government for various reasons to this day. There's a gentleman whom the Indian government is trying to detain. He's a popular Sikh preacher. And the response was to shut down the internet in this province during that time. I think about 27 million people live there. By Indian standards, it's a small province, but by global standards, it's a pretty big number of people. It's almost a population of an entire country like Canada. So, the internet was shut down. People were not able to do SMS communications, many, many other things, all to catch one guy, ostensibly. And then during this time, a lot of global social media accounts commenting on the subject were withheld in India at the request of the Indian government to Twitter. So what you saw, unfortunately, was a shutdown of people's ability to communicate with friends and family, to operate normally in an entire gigantic province full of people. And, all in the sense of, cracking down on, you could call free speech. And maybe you don't like his speech of getting accused of being separatist or something like that, this gentleman who they're trying to catch. But, if a company has a commitment to free speech, and the grave thing that means, it means including all types of political speech, including political speech, which certain governments where you operate don't like. So, I think that this is part and parcel of the change in the Indian government. And if you're operating there as a company, you need to be ready to draw a line of what you're morally standing for or not. I think there's been a lot of pressure on companies operating in China in the last couple of years for reasons which are understandable and somewhat comparable to India. But now the question is not really being asked in India at the moment, even though we're seeing some evidence of crackdowns which are on the spectrum, which you may see in more authoritarian countries.
What is particularly going on in Punjab right now that is it just the search for this kind of nationalist leader, or what are some of the political realities on the ground that they're also trying to tamp down?
Yeah, so as I alluded to earlier, in the 1980s, there was a major insurgency in Punjab by Sikh separatist groups who wanted to create a separate country called Khalistan out of India. So, obviously many people know India used to be one much bigger country, and Pakistan was part of that, and Bangladesh was part of that. And the separation happened when the British left on religious grounds. So Hindus and Muslims sort of got separate states to some degree, although many Muslims still live in India. Now Sikhs were left out of that, and they always wanted to have a separate state. Many of them want to have a separate state in what's now Punjab. And when they tried to do that in the 80s, and they did it by taking up arms, many of them, the government responded very violently. There were a terrible crackdown. There was a attack and bombing of their holy sites and so forth. And there were pogroms in other parts of India against Sikh Indians because of these events, and because of a later assassination of an Indian prime minister by her Sikh bodyguards. It was a big, terrible situation that took place. The Indian government put it down very forcefully. They don't want to see anything like that happen again. And most states, you kind of understandably, they're very, can be very authoritarian towards perceived threats to their sovereignty or their territorial integrity. And we certainly saw that in India in the 80s. And because they're so afraid of that happening again, too, they're quite aggressive against any expression of ostensible or possible separatism among Sikhs today in Punjab. They've tried to co-opt certain Sikhs that they can into the Indian government and military. Those who are not reconcilable, or those who are quite committed to a separate homeland, or those who feel oppressed or discriminated against by Indian government with their minorities, they're considered enemies. So now, to the extent such a movement exists today, and you see it evinced in this gentleman, his name is Amritpal Singh, who's still on the run, and his supporters who still are also on the run in Punjab. It's an evidence of the Indian government's continued fear and paranoia about the subject. And states often overreact to threats like this. They often overreact sometimes with brutality, and you certainly want to not encourage that, and you don't want to enable that when it seems to be taking place.
Yes, and I know I'll return to the Twitter angle in a second. I'm trying to understand the full scope of this. How much of this also has to do with some of the protests by farmers groups because of what Modi has been doing in his time in power, which is like attempting to deregulate and privatize these sectors?
So you can think of the Indian government, the BJP government, it's like a very neoliberal government in a way. It's neoliberal economically. Its approach to identity, you could say, is also neoliberal in many ways. So India as a country which is built in 70 years, it had like a socialist sort of founding. And because of that, there's this big sediment of subsidies and allotments which were kind of set up to keep the many diverse groups of India satisfied in certain ways. One could argue that not all these are efficient, and maybe some, if in the interest of neoliberalism, they should be removed. I think there are many people in the Indian government which have that view, but it's going to antagonize people when you do that. And secondly, there's also a perception of crony capitalism on behalf of Modi and people around him. So 2 years ago, there in Punjab, there's a big protest movement. It was about water rights and dissemination of water between Punjab and their neighbor province Haryana. And people, went on strike. They took up the roads and so forth, and they actually did succeed in getting concessions out of the Indian government. Partly because many people in Punjab are relatively well off, landowners and so forth. They have some political clout as a result of that. So the Indian government did concede, but I think that it was alarming to them in some ways because it was still an expression of political power and assertiveness on the part people in a part of the country who have a history of, many of them have a history of having some desire for their own homeland. So I think it made them nervous, and they're certainly not going to tolerate, or they'll be on guard against further expressions of political assertiveness in Punjab. And I think we're seeing that today. So, I think they conceded with the farmers' protest, but they didn't like it. They didn't like to concede. They don't like seeing that. And I think in India too, generally speaking, the provinces which are majority minority, they tend to experience more, if not hostility from the government, at the very least suspicion. And that suspicion can often translate into kind of harsh measures in response.
So with Elon Musk and his new kind of gutted Twitter working with Narendra Modi and his police state efforts or his repression efforts, I mean, what is your sense of why that coordination is happening? Is it purely because India is a massive market for Twitter, one of their top 5, I believe, or is there anything else at play here?
Well, I tend to have a policy of not assuming malice when I can explain it with incompetence. So my first gut feeling is that Elon Musk took over the company. He made a very bad purchase. He overpaid. He immediately started firing people without much forethought beforehand. Fired a lot of Twitter India staff. Whether he knew or didn't know beforehand that Twitter India was under a lot of pressure from the Indian government, including threats of arrest due to not enforcing some of their ban orders on certain accounts. I'm not sure if he knew that or not, but certainly gutting the staff seemed to have made that branch of Twitter much more permeable to Indian government influence. And now we're seeing that Twitter India is almost acting as like, a supporter of the Indian government actively, and certainly acceding very easily to their demands, which have great political consequences. That's the incompetence explanation. The malice explanation, if one were to think of one in terms of Elon Musk, is that he has big business interests in India, and he has, he wants to expand there. He's tried to expand there for some years. And because India has a lot of governmental controls on investment and so forth, you kind of need to have a good relationship with the Indian government to do that. Whether he wants to burn those bridges as India becomes a bigger and bigger market, I don't know if he wants to do that. I don't know if Twitter free speech is really worth it to him for that. So it could be that he either is turning a blind eye or enabling this change in Twitter India enforcement because he has interest there. And I think it's not an implausible explanation. We tried to get him to talk about it, to answer questions about it. Unfortunately, he wasn't amenable to that. If you contact Twitter's press office today, it's a poop emoji that the automatic response you get.
What?
Yeah, you set it up that way. So I think that it kind of gives you a sense of how much he's really interested in transparency about Twitter, which, one way or another, it's a very, very important communications platform for people all over the world.
Yes. So I'm just trying to clarify this. So when you reach out for comment, the auto reply is a poop emoji.
Yeah, it's a poop emoji. He said he was going to do that, and he set it up. So now press.twitter, whatever the generic email is, gives you a poop emoji back. So to get comment from Twitter now, this shows you how much the staff has been gutted. You kind of have to tweet Elon Musk, and maybe he'll respond. He sort of commented on a previous story we did on Indian suppression, Twitter India suppression, indirectly by saying he's really busy. He spoke to other stuff, so he didn't know about it. That was our quote from it. But there's no formal process, which I think speaks to a broader problem with what's happened with Twitter now. Is that it's a very big, important telecommunications piece of infrastructure, basically.
Yeah.
You went and gutted the infrastructure of it, of the staffing and so forth, and now it's functioning in this hollowed out zombie kind of shell, which maybe to us we can get by with, but if you're living in a country which is authoritarian, or a country which has authoritarian practices, which is the case in parts of India at the moment, the implications of that can be quite dire.
Absolutely. I mean, this guy, he's a child. It's just absolutely Who
He's
runs
not
a company?
Either, he's not very charismatic or funny, even though he's trying very, very hard. So one thing he can't buy is to be funny.
He's trying incredibly hard, which is just what's so depressing about it. Last thoughts here. I mean, you mentioned China, but China does have their own kind of analogs to some of these social media companies, which makes it a little bit different. Are there any efforts that you see in India to circumvent some of the more like US-based Silicon Valley tech platforms, or is it more just now Modi's going to be like, we're open for business, and Elon's a right winger, I'm a right winger, we can make a business relationship work?
It's very, very interesting. There's a lot of countries in the world which would like to put the toothpaste back in the tube when it comes to opening up the internet and the way they did, such that allowing these global platforms and free flow of information. It can be very damaging to very controlled authoritarian systems. China, very uniquely among countries in the world, when the internet was starting up, they created this big firewall, the Great Firewall that they created, with great foresight, in a way, that they want to control the internet. They built their own very robust and capacious and influential domestic internet, and that exists there today. For India to do that, it would take a lot of work to do that, and a lot of resources to very uncertain effect. And they would have to get everyone off these old channels and onto new ones. I think it'd be very difficult for them to do that right now. Other countries which are far more authoritarian and far more at odds with the US, like Iran, they also, in their view, the Iranian government suffers from the free flow of people getting on VPNs to go on Twitter and so forth. They try to create their own domestic intranet to support that. I think even for them, it's very difficult. For India, which has a lot more, they want a relationship with the West, wants investment and wants an relatively open society in some ways. For them to do that would be very difficult. So I think that it'll be hard for them to actually make their own internet with firewalls. I think what they would like to do more is to bend the existing internet more to their own liking as their government policies change. And part of that will entail getting companies like Twitter to enforce rules on their terms.
Murtaza Hussein, reporter at The Intercept. The latest piece is entitled Elon Musk's Twitter Widens Its Censorship of Modi's Critics. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Of course. All right, folks. Well, with that, we are going to wrap up the first hour of this program, head into the fun half, where we'll be taking your calls and reading your IMs. The number is 646-257-3920. You can call in there. We have Brandon in studio. He's not set up yet, but come on through. Hello. Hey. Yep. He'll be in Sam's seat in just a moment, but check out the discourse. Anything I need to plug there? Yeah, he doesn't care. But check out the discourse. And for me, ESVN, we spoke about the controversy the ridiculous controversy over the trash talk at the Iowa versus LSU national championship game. We did a deep dive into the intra NFL owner battles over Thursday Night Football flexing and how Jeff Bezos is flexing his muscles, trying to, his like alpha brain induced muscles, trying to reduce player safety for a better like viewing product in his estimation, and more. YouTube.com/ESVN show. And then on Left Reckoning, do you know who the guest was? Bradley has it.
I'm ready. I have one second. Oh yeah, here we go. They talked about what was going on in Tennessee in terms of the demonstrations at the state house, and how those 3 Democratic lawmakers are at risk of expulsion today. Then they were joined by Keith Brower-Brown to talk about the recent United Auto Workers leadership change in the fight to reform the labor movement. That's youtube.com/leftreckoning and patreon.com/leftreckoning to access the post game.
All right. Well, we're waiting on Matt Binder, but check out Doomed and Scam Economy. Always good stuff. The number is 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
You are in for it.
All right, folks, 646-257-3920. See you in the fun half.
Are you ready?
Who sent us this?
Alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just as delicious as you could imagine.
The alpha males are back. Boy is back. And the alpha males are back.
Just want to degrade the white man.
Alpha males are back.
I take all of it in my throat.
Alpha males are back.
Snowflake says what?
The alpha males are back.
You are a madman.
And the alpha males are back.
Oh no, Sam Seder! What a fucking nightmare!
Bring back DJ.
Yeah, or a couple of them. Just put them in rotation.
DJ Danner.
Well, the problem with those is they're like 45 seconds long, so I don't know if they're enough of a break.
That's fucking nonsense. See white people doing drugs, they look worse than normal white people, and all white people look disgusting.
And the alpha males,
psych, fuck them. Snowflake says what? Snowflake says what?
A hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank. Okay, I'm making stupid money. Hell of a lot of bank. A hell of a lot of bank.
All lives matter. Have you tried doing an impression on a college campus?
I think that there's no reason why reasonable people across the divide can't all agree with this. Psych.
And the alpha males are back. And the Africans are black African. And the alpha males are black. And the Africans are back.
When you see Donald Trump out there, doesn't a little part of you think that America deserves to be taken over by jihadists? Keeping it 100.
Can't knock the hustle.
Come on, fuck them. Things I do for the bigger game plan. By the way, it's my birthday. Happy birthday to me, Jew boy.
I have a thought experiment for you.
And the alpha males are back. Africans are black. Alpha males are black. Africans are back.
Come on. Someone needs to pay the price for blasphemy around here.
I am a total pussy.
We are back. Brandon is here. We're setting up his shop, but he just had to run to the restroom really quickly. Hope that's not, too much information, but I think he'll be okay. He should be back soon. If he doesn't fall in. Okay.